Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 665, and today is August 26th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to get through on today's show, but first, a word from our sponsor, and that is the Expat Money Summit 2024, which is the world's largest offshore event and taking place entirely online from October 7th through the 11th. Now, there is a great list of speakers for the event. Headline speaker, of course, Dr. Ron Paul. We also have Tom Woods, Scott Horton, and Doug Casey. So really a great list of speakers. And of course, because people listen to this podcast, they're probably, fans of what I have to say. Well, I'm also going to be a speaker at the event. Myself, Dave DeCamp, and Hervoya Morik will be on a VIP panel for the event discussing the possibility of World War III. Is it a genuine concern or fear-mongering? So at the summit, there's going to be a lot more than foreign policy. You will discover why becoming an expat can preserve your liberty and wealth, and how to get that done, how you buy international real estate, diversify your assets, and get that second passport. So a lot of great stuff to learn at the Expat Money Summit 2024. You could get your complimentary ticket by heading over to expatmoneysummit.com. Again, that's expatmoneysummit.com, or following through the affiliate link in the show notes page. Additionally, if you use the promo code Kyle when you get your VIP ticket, that will save you $100 on your purchase. And again, there's a link in the show notes page to make that process as easy for you as possible. Again, expatmoneysummit.com. Check it out. Use the promo code Kyle. All right, before we get into the show today, just want to remind people that the show is hosted through the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And of course, follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_ for all the articles I write and other things that I put out either through the Institute or antiwar.com. Additionally, me and my wife are expecting our first child sometime in the next couple of weeks, and I am planning to take a 2-week paternity leave. So if you stop seeing conflicts of interest in your feed, don't worry, we will return. And if you want updates, follow me on Twitter, and I will post a couple personal updates during that time, just hopefully letting everybody know that everything is going okay. All right, let's get into the news today. First story up here. Weapon makers see huge cash flow influx amid global tensions. So as the war, and I wrote this one for the Libertarian Institute on August 26th. So as the war in Ukraine and the Middle East continue to rage, Vertical Research Partners forecasts top weapons manufacturers will experience record cash flow during the coming years. The analysis, which was commissioned by the Financial Times, reports the leading 15 defense contractors are forecast to log free cash flow of $52 billion in 2026, with the top 5 U.S. defense contractors are forecasted to generate a cash flow of $26 billion. The record cash flow in 2026 will be double the 2021 numbers. The record cash flows are part of an upward trend for weapons makers already benefiting from a surge in global military spending and conflict. Washington is driving the worldwide arms race. The U.S. military budget is about the same as the next 10 countries combined. Additionally, under President Joe Biden, Washington funneled billions in weapons to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. The policy has led to massive wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and Lebanon. Additionally, tensions in the South China Sea are boiling, and Israel and Iran are on the brink of a potential direct war. The White House is well positioned to de-escalate many of the world's conflicts. The U.S. could push Israel and Ukraine to negotiate by leveraging Washington's military aid over to Kiev and Tel Aviv. In the South China Sea, potential conflicts between China and Taiwan or the Philippines have been partly driven by Washington's pledge to go to war against Beijing for Manila and Taipei. The U.S. has also given the Philippines and Taiwan's hundreds of billions in weapons, further provoking China. And so I think this is a direct result of not only the Biden foreign policy, but the American foreign policy over the course of the past few decades, really since the end of the Cold War. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, now Biden, with Biden, I think, being the worst of them all. He has refused to negotiate anywhere, talk with any adversary whatsoever, which means tensions can't de-escalate. Even when American officials meet with Chinese officials, typically these meetings don't go particularly well. They've turned into shouting matches with each country insulting each other, or when you have major opportunities for resets, such as Biden's summit with Xi in San Francisco, we end up with things like Biden calling Xi a dictator the same day, rather than trying to take the diplomatic win. Now, in other areas of the world, it hasn't just been an unwillingness to negotiate with the adversary, but constant and direct antagonization is leading closer and closer to war. And so, of course, we saw this in Ukraine. We kept telling Russia that Ukraine will one day join NATO, knowing that we have no timeline for Ukraine to join NATO, and that the corruption and the Nazi problem and other problems within Ukraine make it impossible for the country to join the North Atlantic Alliance. Still, Russia was asking the U.S. to close the door to Ukrainian NATO membership, and so the U.S. felt it had to keep saying we would never close the door to NATO membership for Ukraine, and they started treating Ukraine as a de facto member of the NATO alliance, particularly by holding major war games within Ukrainian territory, which means right on the Russian border. And even at that point, there was still time and room to negotiate, particularly in the latter half of 2021, maybe the final quarter of that year. Russia presented several proposals to the U.S. and tried to get the U.S. to negotiate on a series of very important security issues for Russia, which, of course, Ukraine being a member of NATO was number one, but also security assistance to Ukraine was a major one. Just the NATO force presence in Eastern Europe. It isn't so much that NATO has expanded right up to the Russian border, but they've also transferred their troops and built military equipment all the way up to the Russian border. Recently we talked about a story that I wrote up for the Libertarian Institute, where Lithuania is building a base for 4,800 German soldiers and 100 German tanks to be just a dozen miles from the Belarusian border, which is one of Russia's key allies. And so this westward expansion or eastward expansion of NATO arms and military presence was a major issue for Russia. The U.S. Aegis ashore sites in Poland and Romania, another major issue for Russia where we could negotiate it. The problem with the Aegis ashore systems compared to, say, a Patriot missile battery or a THAAD system is they use the same Mk-41 vertical launcher tubes that could fire Tomahawk cruise missiles, which could be equipped with nuclear weapons. And so Russia found that these particular Aegis ashore missile defense systems were particularly provocative. Additionally, Washington's excuse for placing them in Poland and Romania were quite questionable, since they said, it was due to the threat from Iran, which didn't make any sense whatsoever. And was really, I think, from the Russian perspective, why else would the Americans want to put this system in Eastern Europe unless it was to one day fit Tomahawk missiles into these launchers, and then we're able to fire them at Russia. And of course, Tomahawk missiles could reach Moscow in a relatively short amount of time if launched from Poland and Romania. So, these are major, major issues for Russia. Now, we know this was in the spring of 2022 that this was reported. There was a Biden administration official who I believe went on a podcast and said that the White House didn't think that these were serious issues for Russia. And essentially the only thing that the White House offered the Kremlin was that they would allow weapons inspectors at the Aegis ashore sites in Poland and Romania to make sure, or so Russia could, I guess, verify that there weren't Tomahawk missiles at the facility. But this was, first of all, not the top issue for Russia, because I think they worry that even if they agree to put weapons inspectors there, of course, they could always kick those weapons inspectors out. And so the real issue for Russia is simply removing those Aegis ashore systems. And you may think, oh, well, why would the US really curtail its defense systems because of something that Russia wants? But it's important to remember that at the end of the Cold War, we had several major treaties with Russia that no longer exist, or de facto no longer exist, such as the New START Treaty. But if you look at the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was supposed to take medium range, intermediate range missiles, nuclear capable missiles, and their land-based launchers, and remove them from the battlefield, that was major. That treaty no longer exists. But additionally, there was an anti-ballistic missile treaty. These systems weren't supposed to exist, and yet the U.S. left the treaty under George W. Bush, developed the systems, and then put the Aegis ashore in Poland and Romania. And so returning to the ABM treaty would be a major step towards peace. And that's really, I think, what Russia was trying to return to by getting the U.S. Defense systems in Europe, the Aegis Ashore systems removed, but the U.S. refused to negotiate on that. We also refused to negotiate on the force presence in Eastern Europe, so we didn't tell Russia, we'll stop having war games in the Baltic states, the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea. We'll keep our war games on the western half of Europe and Germany and things like that. That wasn't something we are willing to agree to. Maybe pausing the force buildup in Eastern Europe, we're not willing to agree to that. And additionally, they didn't think Russia was serious about Ukrainian NATO membership, and so they didn't negotiate with Russia on that issue either. And so, as you see, these are major issues for the Russians that the Biden administration just wholly decided not to negotiate with Russia on, and now we have this major war in Ukraine that's sucking up, just hundreds of billions of dollars of our tax dollars, transferring most of it to Biden's and Washington's friends in the military industrial complex. And then they send some weapons to Ukraine to be destroyed by the Russians and to get more Ukrainian civilians killed. Israel, I think the choice is even more, easy. All the U.S. has to do is tell Israel to knock it off in Gaza. They've already decimated the Gaza Strip. It's not like that is ever going to be a habitable piece of land for the Palestinians again. At least the slow motion ethnic genocide in Gaza is essentially complete. The destruction that the Israelis have laid in Gaza is just absolutely massive. 50% of homes destroyed. And this was like 3 or 4 months ago that stat came out. On yesterday's show, I talked about how Palestinians are forced to live in just 11% of the Strip. Most of the hospitals are gone. Most of the schools are gone. Israel's destroying the mosques now. There's just not a lot of infrastructure left in Gaza, and certainly not what you need to support a population of 2.3 million desperately poor people. And so unless Israel is going to undergo a absolutely radical shift in policy when it comes to Gaza, meaning they're going to let massive amounts of aid in, Palestinians are going to be able to leave and return to seek medical treatment abroad because there's at least 90,000 Palestinians with moderate to severe injuries that are going to require lifelong care, much of which probably won't be available in the Gaza Strip, especially seeing there's going to be a limited number of medical facilities and a huge number of people who just need the routine medical care. Where are people going to get this advanced care that they need? And so it doesn't seem to me that there's really a sustainable path here for the Palestinians to remain in Gaza without a major Israeli change in policy when it comes to how they're going to let the Palestinians rebuild Gaza, which, they've been bombing the Strip for 15 years and just not letting the Palestinians rebuild the thing. And so, the situation has gotten worse and worse and worse and worse in Gaza over that time. But now everything is completely destroyed and you have to rebuild from the bottom up. And so if they're not going to let rebar and concrete and steel into Gaza, you simply can't rebuild the facilities that you need to support that population. And so rather than even at this point telling Netanyahu, like, you're done with the bombing campaign, the U.S. just refuses to do it. And the reason this is so important for the global military sales, of course, is this means we had to sell Israel weapons, not just for the war in Gaza, but also the potential future war with Hezbollah, the potential future war with Iran. We could prevent and really tone down all the violence in the Middle East by a factor of 10. All we have to do is get Israel to stop the bombing in Gaza, and the White House refuses to do so. And almost even more baffling, even when the Tel Aviv, Netanyahu, refuses to go along, like let's say Biden announces a ceasefire plan, Netanyahu will refuse to go along with it, knowing that there's no repercussions. And then on top of that, when the Palestinians accept that plan, the White House is going to pretend like it's still the Palestinians that are creating the problem and that the Israelis are being reasonable and trying to negotiate. And if that's not enough reasons right there to just want to end the wars and militarism in the Middle East, the U.S. has also spent billions of dollars bombing Yemen on behalf of the Israelis, when the Houthis say the only reason that they're still attacking shipping in the Red Sea or launching drones at Israel is because of Israel's onslaught in Gaza. And so, again, you have a real ability to de-escalate all the tensions in the Middle East for the White House. All they have to do is force Israel to stop the bombing campaign in Gaza, and they have all the leverage in the world to do it, and they're just completely refusing to do so. And once again, in the South China Sea, a lot of the tensions between China and Taiwan are there because the U.S. is giving Taiwan weapons. This is a big change under the Biden administration. These foreign military financing, which means we're giving Taiwan hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to then buy US made weapons. And essentially they're going to Taiwan for free. We're doing the same thing to the Philippines. Both of these things are seen as hugely provocative by China. On top of that, when it comes to Taiwan, President Biden has changed U.S. policy. For decades and decades since Nixon, we had a policy of strategic ambiguity, meaning that we told the Chinese and the Taiwanese that maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't come to Taiwan's aid if China attacked. And this had a two-pronged effect. One, China wasn't sure if the U.S. would enter on Taiwan's behalf, and so it deterred China from wanting to go to war with Taiwan. But also, Taiwan didn't know if the U.S. would enter on its behalf, which meant that if Taiwan was too provocative, then the U.S. may not enter the war on their behalf. And so it forced the Taiwanese to try to pursue a path to avoid war with China. But really, this started mid-Trump administration, where we're conducting the Taiwan Strait transits with major U.S. warships every single month. I think they're happening 13 times a year at the end of the Trump administration, at the beginning of the Biden administration. I believe it has slowed some. I imagine that at least part of that is due to the military, the Navy, particularly increased needs. We have, 2 aircraft carrier strike groups in the Middle East region. We, of course, have a lot of ships dedicated to the Ukraine conflict and things like that. And so all of this is tying down other assets that may be in the Indo-Pacific. And additionally, we've had other steps with Taiwan that Beijing has also seen as provocative, such as Nancy Pelosi's trip to the island or other top American officials meeting with Taipei. And then when it comes to the Philippines, this has been a little bit of a new ramp up under the Biden administration, where we're pledging to go to war with China over the Spratly Islands, which are little reefs in the middle of the South China Sea that both China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, and Malaysia claim territory over these little stretch of islands. And the U.S. is saying that they're willing to go to war against China to defend the Philippines' claims to these islands. So again, all these major provocations, and recently, Manila and Beijing actually signed an agreement that was supposed to de-escalate tensions, particularly around the second Thomas Shoal. And then a week later, the U.S. gave the Philippines $500 million in foreign military financing, which means $500 million to buy U.S. made weapons, and told the Philippines that if there's any conflict with China, we will enter the war on their behalf. And now we have 2 collisions in the past week between Chinese and Philippines Coast Guard vessels near the Sabina Shoal. So this is a completely unnecessary escalation, and it's just all about making the arms makers more money. And it's also a part of the Biden administration policy, where if we bat down against anyone ever anywhere, that means that we're bowing to dictators and we're giving up democracy and all this other absolutely stupid rhetoric. Diplomacy is essential to geopolitics. It is one of the weapons in the American arsenal. It shouldn't just be that our only weapon is our military, but we don't use diplomacy diplomacy whatsoever with any of our adversaries or really any of our allies. We don't use diplomacy with Israel. We don't push Israel to do what we want. We don't push Ukraine to do what we want or what would be best for America. It's really all just about what's best for Washington, the empire, and the military-industrial complex. All right, so to get just a scope of the weapons that we have sent to Israel, this one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, Israel says U.S. has delivered 50,000 tons of military aid to Israel since the start of the slaughter. So the Israeli Defense Ministry said Monday that the U.S. has delivered over 50,000 tons of weapons and other military equipment since the start of Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza, demonstrating the Biden administration's staunch support for the slaughter. Since October 7th, 105 ships and 500 transport planes have brought U.S. military aid shipments to Israel. The Israeli military said the deliveries included armored vehicles, munitions, ammunition, personal protective gear, and medical equipment. The ministry added that the U.S. support was crucial for sustaining the IDF's operational capabilities during the ongoing war. Back in April, President Biden signed a bill into law that included $17 billion in additional military aid for Israel on top of the $3.8 billion the country receives each year. The State Department recently approved a series of major arms deals for Israel worth $20 billion, including a fleet of F-15 fighter jets. Besides the military aid, the Biden administration is also providing intelligence for operations in Gaza and political support for the UN. Not to mention we have drones doing overflights of the Gaza Strip, collecting that intelligence. So the administration has also helped Israel by portraying Hamas as an obstacle to the hostage deal and ceasefire, even as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been working to sabotage the chance of an agreement, and that is per Israeli officials. That isn't coming from Hamas, the Palestinians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, or even an Arab or a Muslim or a Christian. It's coming from the Jews. The Israeli officials are saying that it is Netanyahu that is responsible for undermining these talks. So, over the past 10 months, the U.S.-backed Israeli assault on Gaza has killed at least 40,435 people, including over 16,000 children, according to the Gaza Health Ministry's latest numbers. The ministry figures are considered a low estimate as it doesn't include the estimated 10,000 people who are missing and presumed buried under the rubble. At least 4,000 of those are children. Many more could have died from indirect causes Israel has shattered Gaza's infrastructure. And so there's 90,000 people that have received severe to moderate injuries. Those could be life-threatening if untreated. And of course, a lot of those injuries have not been treated. We've had doctors from the U.S. or other Western countries come back and report that, there's a lot of people who could otherwise be saved, but cannot be because of the conditions in Israel. And a lot of that is due to Israel's destruction of Gaza's healthcare facilities, and intentionally so, right? It's not that Israel just happened to hit the Al-Shifa hospital with an airstrike, or, maybe the hospital in Khan Yunis, the Al-Nasser hospital, was being used as a military facility by Hamas, and so was therefore shut down. It's been systematic. Every hospital in Gaza has been attacked. Most of them have been shelled. Most of them have been besieged and then forced to be evacuated from the Palestinians. A lot of the doctors have been rounded up and thrown into Israeli torture prisons where they've been sodomized and abused in other absolutely horrific ways. Some of them haven't even made it out of these torture prisons alive. The conditions there have been just so diabolical and disgusting. Talking about keeping people in diapers and handcuffed for upwards of 24 hours a day. The handcuffs are so tight that, they're the plastic zip tie handcuffs. And so they're so tight, they cause first cuts and then infections, and the infections turn into causes to amputate entire arms. But sometimes it's not done in time and people get sepsis and they end up dying from that. So, it's an absolute horror show, and 50,000 tons of U.S. weapons have made it possible for Israel to do. All right. How the U.S. Other ways the U.S. is helping Israel. Top U.S. general visits northern Israel after Hezbollah attack. So, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's General Charles Q. Brown, the highest-ranking U.S. military officer, visited northern Israel on Monday, a day after Israel and Hezbollah exchanged their heaviest round of fire since October 7th. Brown's visit demonstrates strong U.S. support for Israel in its fight against Hezbollah. The U.S. provided Israel with intelligence for its strikes in southern Lebanon on Sunday and helped track Hezbollah missiles and drones that were fired into northern and central Israel. Brown made the visit to Israel's military Northern Command headquarters with the IDF chief of staff. According to the Times of Israel, the IDF said the two military leaders presented with the ongoing combat against Hezbollah during the war and the operational plans for the future, and discussed security and strategic issues regarding the expansion of operational tools and strengthening of regional partnerships as a part of the response to threats in the Middle East. So the U.S. has deployed additional warships and fighter jets to the Middle East as a threat to Hezbollah and Iran, and has pledged to defend Israel. The White House said Monday that the U.S. will continue to maintain the presence of 2 aircraft carriers in the region, as it is expecting Iran to launch an attack on Israel as retaliation for the Israeli assassination of Hamas's political chief in Iran. And the fact that Iran hasn't responded yet. Now, some people are portraying this as weakness and that the American threats are still powerful, right? That Iran is afraid to attack Israel out of fear it will be attacked from the U.S. And I do think that's certainly probably an aspect of this, that Iran doesn't want to escalate this war in a way that leads to Iran getting attacked by the U.S. However, I think it's also a sign of strength that Iran doesn't feel the need to respond right away. That they don't feel the need to take immediate action and escalate this war into a major conflict. And really, that's what's best for the citizens of the country. And so, I don't think it's just a sign of weakness that Iran hasn't launched this retaliation yet. So according to Israel's Channel 12, in some of Brown's discussions with Israeli officials, the Israelis push for the U.S. to establish a credible military threat against Iran or potentially launch strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities to prevent Iran from acquiring a bomb. Despite claims from Israel, there's no indication Iran is seeking nuclear weapons, something that has been acknowledged by U.S. intelligence in this year's threat assessment, although you could imagine that Israel attacking Iran's nuclear facilities would be the kind of thing that could push Iran to decide to make nuclear bombs. Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant also met with General Brown and hinted at potential military action against Iran's civilian nuclear program. Gallant said, "We are at a point where we must always be ready to fulfill our shared commitment of Israel and the U.S. to prevent Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon." And you really just worry that this is the exact kind of thing that's going to push Iran to acquire nuclear weapons and not the opposite. All right, so we're going to wrap up here with one more story from our friend Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Egypt reiterates its opposition to Israeli military presence at Gaza-Egypt border. And so this is significant just because, if we are going to end the tensions in the Middle East, Iran is willing not to retaliate against Israel if the war in Gaza is brought to a close. So again, another way we could really just relieve all tensions in the Middle East just by ending this conflict. And Netanyahu continues to add new demands every time we get close to having a ceasefire and a hostage deal, by the way, a deal that would bring back the remaining Israelis in Gaza. And, he's just actively getting in the way of that. So this is another way. This one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Egypt on Monday reiterated its objection to Israel maintaining control of the Gaza-Egypt border, known as the Philadelphia corridor, as a part of any Gaza hostage deal and ceasefire deal. So an Egyptian official said, according to Turkish media, Egypt reiterated to all relevant parties its rejection of any Israeli presence at the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing or the Philadelphia corridor. corridor. The comment came after hostage deal talks concluded in Cairo on Sunday, with reports saying no progress was made. Israel's demand to maintain the Philadelphia corridor is one of the main obstacles to a deal, as Hamas wants an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists on controlling the border even though Israeli military doesn't think it's necessary. On Saturday, Reuters reported that Netanyahu has been in dispute with Israeli negotiators who are willing to agree to an Israeli withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor. So a person familiar with the negotiations told Reuters the Prime Minister insists the situation will continue, contrary to pressure from certain elements in the negotiating team who are willing to withdraw from there. And so again, we have a potential deal on the table, and it's not Hamas, it's Netanyahu, our ally, who we given 50,000 tons in weapons to, is refusing to agree to conditions that are favorable to him to end this conflict, because what Netanyahu really wants is to drag this war on. And as I pointed out on this show in the past, this is a point I want to make again. So I think Netanyahu is doing this in part because he is worried about going to jail and understands that this war going on for as long as possible is good for him politically. I also think Netanyahu is extremely concerned about his legacy and understands that for decades he propped up Hamas in Gaza and used them as a cudgel to not have to negotiate with the Palestinians whatsoever. And that absolutely blew up in his face on October 7th when Hamas launched a major attack on southern Israel. And so I think Netanyahu believes that he must commit to the ethnic cleansing and the elimination of all Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to basically restore his legacy as, okay, yeah, I did that policy, but look at how well it worked out for the Israelis. We got rid of 2.3 million Palestinians and captured the Gaza Strip, this piece of land on the Mediterranean Sea that could probably be absolutely beautiful and economic, boon for Israel should it control that territory and be able to build infrastructure there, as they didn't allow the Palestinians to do for such a long period of time. I'm not so sure that Netanyahu is just refusing to negotiate because of the hard right members of his coalition, particularly Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. Now, they have certainly threatened to leave the coalition and attempt to dissolve the government if Netanyahu does agree to this deal. However, Yair Lapid, the leader of the opposition coalition to Netanyahu, has said that he has ample members of his coalition who are willing to actually vote in favor of a Netanyahu government if Ben-Gvir and Smotrich leave it. And so it's not necessarily just that the government would collapse if Netanyahu accepted a deal. Is politically popular in Israel to accept one, and he does have support from what is essentially his left flank, although I wouldn't really call Yair Lapid on the left. But as far as Israeli politics go, he does have this cover on his left flank if he really did want to end this conflict. So a Hamas spokesperson said, according to the Cradle, the Hamas delegation demand that the occupation be bound by what was agreed upon on July 2nd, based on what Biden stated in his speech and what the UN Security Council resolution said. Hamas confirms its readiness to implement what has been agreed upon in a way that achieves supreme interests of the people and stops the aggression against them. The Hamas delegation stressed that the movement's position that any agreement must include a permanent ceasefire, a complete withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and the freedom of return of all residents to their areas, relief and reconstruction, and a serious exchange deal are what Hamas is looking for, and Israel is, and particularly Netanyahu, are just absolutely unwilling to agree to that, bring this to a close when it could have been. And of course, the U.S. could force Netanyahu to do it just by ending the weapon shipments, and they are absolutely refusing to do that. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Back with more shows later in the week.